Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I was invited to a secret dark web Christmas party. All the guests are wearing my face. Alright, so I'll start by saying I'm not the type to mess around with the dark web. I'm not that guy who goes looking for cheap thrills in the shadowy corners of the internet. Sure, I've clicked through my fair share of spooky Reddit threads, listened to podcasts about unsettling internet mysteries, and watched those deep dive YouTube videos with guys who somehow find ancient websites frozen in time. But that's as far as I ever went. That was until I found myself stuck in bed for 2 weeks last December after a nasty fall on some ice. I'm not proud of this, but with nothing to do except scroll endlessly and watch TV, I got bored, really bored. I found myself going down deeper and darker internet rabbit holes, convinced that I'd hit some kind of uncharted territory where no one else dared to go. It was all harmless at first. Those urban legend websites, conspiracy forums, and subreddits with cryptic puzzles. But then I started hearing whispers about something called the jingle. I know, right? Sounds dumb, but the more I read, the more curious I got. Apparently, the jingle was an exclusive invitation to a virtual Christmas party hosted somewhere in the deep web. And like every story worth its salt, it was rumored to be haunted or cursed or something. Some said the party was just a cover for a high-stakes digital scavenger hunt. Others claimed it was a gathering of elites trading secrets you'd never want to know. The weirdest rumor? That people who went didn't come back quite the same, whatever that meant. One late night, when the snow outside my window cast an eerie glow in my dark room, I got my first taste of what the jingle really was. I'd been mindlessly hopping through encrypted forums and chat rooms when a user named silent_snowfall32 dropped me a private message. You seem curious. Join us. Accept or decline. Your choice. Underneath it was a link. No warning. No context. Just a string of garbled text that seemed to taunt me with its mystery. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would you ever click that link? And trust me, if this were any other day, I wouldn't have. But something about it felt personal. I stared at the blinking cursor, its slow, rhythmic pulse matching the drumming of my heart. The snow outside seemed to fall slower, heavier, and I felt a chill spread through me that wasn't from the cold. Against every ounce of reason in my body, I clicked. The page that loaded was so minimalist, it was almost funny. Just a black screen, a single red box in the center, with bold white text. Welcome, guest. Your attendance has been noted. See you soon. It didn't give me a chance to back out. No confirm button or are you sure pop up. It just blinked, and my browser snapped shut on its own. I sat there, staring at my dim reflection on the screen, heart thudding so hard it hurt. I tried to reopen my browser, but it wouldn't budge. My computer made a low, buzzing sound, almost like it was laughing at me. I pushed my chair back, my breath misting in the chill of my unheated room. It felt too quiet now, like the world outside had taken a breath and was waiting. That's when my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my skin, the sound rattling through the silent room like a gunshot. I picked it up with the shaky fingers. An unknown number. No name. Just a message with a single line. Wear your best. You're the guest of honor. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. I stayed up, ears straining against the silence. Every creak of my old house sending chills racing down my spine. By 4 a.m., my phone lay on the bed beside me, screen dark, as if mocking me for expecting more. No more messages came. No follow-up weirdness. Just the growing sensation that I'd made a mistake. A big one. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was just an elaborate prank. Someone online pulling my leg. Maybe it was one of those creepy viral marketing campaigns for an indie horror movie. You know, the kind that reels you in and leaves you feeling dumb when it's all for a 2-star film nobody ends up watching. I even considered telling one of my friends, but what would I say? Hey, I think I might have just RSVP'd to some kind of ghost party on the dark web. Yeah, no. I wasn't ready to have them look at me like I'd lost it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across my room, I decided to shake it off. I turned on some music, loud enough to drown out my nerves, and made dinner. Something simple, something normal, the kind of thing that makes you feel like everything's fine, even when you know it isn't. But just as I was finishing up, something slammed into my front door. Not a knock. A full-on shoulder-thudding crash. The type of sound you'd expect if someone was trying to break the door down. I froze mid-stir, the wooden spoon clattering out of my hand and sending sauce splattering across the stove. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My eyes darted to the window, but the street outside was empty. The snow had started falling again, fat and silent. Not even a car tire track marked the road. The crash came again, louder this time. It rattled the hinges, making the walls shiver. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Before I could muster the courage to move, a voice came from the other side of the door. "Are you ready?" It was soft, almost sing-song, and had this strange, echoing quality, like whoever, or whatever it was, spoke into a long, empty tunnel. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. Nope. 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 This was not happening. I reached for my phone on the counter, the screen lighting up as my fingers brushed against it. My heart stopped cold when I saw it. Another message from the same unknown number. "It's time. Open the door." I backed away, my chest tightening like a vice. My mind raced through a million worst-case scenarios. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I tell them? And anyway, who's to say whatever was on the other side of that door would wait patiently for law enforcement? The voice came again, softer this time. "We're all waiting. Just open up, and you'll see." Suddenly, the smell hit me. It was subtle at first, mingling with the burnt remnants of my forgotten dinner, but soon it grew stronger, suffocating. Pine needles. The bitter, sticky scent of crushed pine needles mixed with something else. Something metallic and sharp. Blood. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. It turned my stomach, bile clawing at my throat. Without thinking, I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time and slammed my bedroom door shut behind me. I crouched low, my eyes fixed on the small sliver of light at the bottom. My heartbeat was so loud, it drowned out everything else. I counted my breaths, forcing them to come slow and even, as if that would somehow make me invisible. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I lost track of time, trapped in my own head with nothing but the rasp of my breathing and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor beneath me. Just when I started to think it was over, that the nightmare had moved on, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound. Someone or something was sliding a thin object under my door. The scraping stopped, replaced by a rustle. My gut screamed at me not to move, but curiosity overrode the fear. I crawled forward on my hands and knees, my body trembling as I reached out and lifted the thin sheet of paper now lying on the floor. Scrawled in red ink, or maybe it wasn't ink, were 3 words: "Wear your face." A chill ran down my spine, and the silence of my room thickened, pressing in on me like a weight. Before I could react, my phone buzzed. This time, the message read, "We're so excited you're here." I didn't move for what felt like hours. The note clutched between my fingers, as if holding it too tightly would make it burst into flames. The words, "Wear your face," swirled around my mind, refusing to make sense. The buzzing in my ears grew louder, mixing with the thump of my pulse until it was a roar. It was only when the chill creeping up my legs turned into a bone-deep ache that I realized I was still kneeling on the floor, locked in a trance. Slowly, I stood up, my joints popping with the effort, and placed the note on my desk. The window next to me rattled as a gust of wind swept past, rattling the glass and leaving behind an unnatural stillness. My room felt different now, smaller, like the shadows were pressing in. Every object seemed off, like it didn't quite belong to me. My eyes darted to my reflection in the dark screen of my computer, but the shape staring back didn't feel like it was mine. I had to get out of there, if only for a moment, just to clear my head. I turned toward the door, but the sound of soft, dragging footsteps in the hallway stopped me cold. The floorboards creaked one after another, in a pattern too slow to be a person simply walking by. It was deliberate, like something was testing the weight of each step. My mind raced. Did I lock the front door after hearing that voice? Did it matter? Whatever was in the hallway didn't sound like it cared much for locked doors. I reached for the baseball bat I kept propped in the corner, a relic from my high school days, and held it in front of me like it was anything more than a piece of polished wood. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound itself. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was listening, waiting for a signal to move again. I held my breath until black dots danced across my vision, and then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like fingernails raking across the wall outside my room. "Don't look," I whispered to myself, eyes fixed on the crack at the bottom of the door. The scraping stopped, and an eerie quiet filled the space between heartbeats. Then, from below the door, something dark and paper-thin slid its way into my room. Another note. I stared at it as if it might snap at me like a snake. This one was different, longer, with slanted handwriting that seemed to sink into the page. "Come as you are, or don't come at all. Midnight. Wear your face." My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the suffocating quiet. I jumped, almost dropping the bat. Another message from that unknown number. "Check your closet." Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to bolt out of the room and out of the house if I had to. But before I could make a decision, my eyes flicked to the closet door at the far end of my room. It was cracked open, a sliver of darkness visible between the wooden slats. My hands trembled as I took a step forward, then another. The bat felt heavier, more useless with each step. I reached out, nudging the closet door open with the tip of the bat, and nearly retched at what I saw. Hanging from the rail, where my winter jackets should have been, was a mask of my face. It was horrifyingly detailed, with every line, every imperfection, as if someone had taken a mold while I slept and created a perfect replica. The eyes were hollow, lifeless black voids that seemed to follow me. Taped to the mask was another note. This one was simpler, but far more unsettling. Wear this, and you will be one of us. The phone buzzed one last time, the screen lighting up with a notification that made my stomach drop. Your ride is outside. The sound of a car engine hummed through the thin walls of my house, and headlights cut across my window, bathing the room in a harsh, artificial glow. I backed away from the mosque, from the open closet, from everything. But then I heard it, a chorus of voices, low and echoing, like a chant rising from the ground. We're waiting. The words thrummed in my bones, and I glanced outside. Parked in front of my house was an old black car, idling as exhaust curled into the freezing air. The driver was nothing more than a silhouette, but the rearview mirror caught a sliver of their face. My face. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug, the world spinning as the chanting grew louder. It came from everywhere now. The walls, the floor, the very air around me. My phone buzzed again, an incoming call this time. I didn't answer, but the screen flashed with a video feed instead of a name. The faces on the screen, dozens, maybe hundreds, all wore my mask, and in the middle of that nightmare crowd stood one that moved differently, a figure whose hollow dark eyes met mine through the screen. Come on, guest of honor, it whispered, lips moving in sync with the chanting. We saved you a seat. I don't remember making the decision to move, but before I knew it, I was standing at the top of the stairs, every nerve in my body screaming in protest. The front door loomed at the bottom, like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Outside, the low hum of the car engine was steady, patient, as if whoever was waiting had all the time in the world. The mask from my closet was in my hand now, its cold, rubbery surface brushing against my palm like a living thing. The chanting had stopped, but the silence it left was worse, echoing through my head as I slowly made my way down the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound carving into the quiet. I half expected the driver to burst in, to pull me out kicking and screaming, but they just waited, headlights pooling yellow against the walls. I reached the front door and peered through the peephole. The car sat in the snow, dark and ominous, with frost creeping across its windows like webs. The driver's silhouette didn't move. They were still as a statue, head tilted slightly, as if watching me through the mirror. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The night air punched through me, cold enough to burn, and I felt my pulse quicken as I stepped outside. The snow crunched under my feet, sharp and brittle, the only sound in the suffocating silence. My breath plumed in front of me, catching the light like smoke. The car door clicked open before I reached it. The driver stepped out, and my breath caught in my chest. It was me, but not me. This figure had my features, my height, even my stance, but their skin was waxy, pale, with eyes that glistened like wet ink. It smiled, but the expression never reached its eyes. Welcome, it said, voice low and familiar, like an echo trapped in a cave. It motioned to the back seat, with a hand that looked human, but felt wrong somehow. Too smooth, too perfect. Your seat is waiting. I wanted to run, to turn around, and bolt into the darkness, but my legs were frozen, anchored to the spot by fear. Before I could react, the figure stepped aside, and I saw them, two more shapes in the back seat, wearing my face. They grinned in unison, their mouths too wide, too jagged, filled with teeth that didn't belong. Come on, one of them said, pressing their hand against the window, leaving a greasy print that smeared downward like blood. I didn't move, couldn't move, until I felt the cold rubber of the mask I held in my hand. The message on the notes came rushing back. Wear this, and you will be one of us. I glanced back at the house, at the warm yellow glow of the lights inside. It seemed so distant, so separate from the icy grip of the street and the nightmare waiting for me. But when I looked back, the reflection in the car window made my blood turn to ice. There were more of them now. Dozens, all lined up down the street, masks pressed against the glass, unmoving, all me. Their empty eyes stared, unblinking. "We're waiting," the driver said again, this time with an edge to their voice, like the scrape of metal on stone. It reached out and took my free hand, and the sensation was colder than the snow underfoot. It didn't pull. It didn't have to. My legs moved on their own, guided by the chill in its grip and the silent commands in those hollow eyes. I slid into the back seat, the leather cold against my skin. The door closed with a thud that echoed through my chest, sealing me inside with the twin reflections of myself. The silence was absolute now. No hum of the engine, no whisper of wind, just the oppressive, pulsing quiet. "Put it on," one of the figures said, gesturing to the mask in my hands. Its smile stretched wider, splitting the corners of its mouth until I could see the raw, pink flesh underneath. I swallowed hard and raised the mask to my face. The rubber was damp, slick, and when it touched my skin, a shiver ran through me so hard I almost dropped it. As soon as the mask settled over my face, everything changed. The silence shattered into a cacophony of laughter, shrill and grating, like children's giggles mixed with the growl of animals. The figures around me clapped in eerie synchronization, their hands thudding against the seats like drums. The driver turned around, its head tilting as it watched me. "Welcome to the party," it said, eyes glistening with something that wasn't human. The car jolted forward, and the scenery outside blurred into a mess of lights and shadows. We weren't on my street anymore. Trees rose like claws on either side, and through the frost-bitten windows, I could see them, more figures in masks, standing perfectly still among the trees, faces all turned toward the car as it passed. And then, up ahead, a building loomed in the dark, draped in strings of flickering Christmas lights that buzzed like angry bees. The laughter grew louder, a chorus that hummed through my chest as the car pulled to a stop. The house, if you could even call it that, was made of warped wood, slanted at impossible angles, like it was trying to twist itself out of reality. "Come on," the figure beside me said, its voice blending with the others until it was a chorus, a single mind with a single intent. "It's time to celebrate." I stepped out, legs shaking, and looked up at the glowing, grinning doorway that awaited me. The night pressed in around us, alive with whispers and footsteps, as the chanting began again. "The guest of honor is here." The door swung open before I could reach for it, creaking on hinges that groaned like an old, dying animal. Warm, golden light spilled out, but it wasn't inviting. It was suffocating, thick with the scent of burnt pine and something sweet and rotting. The figures inside stood perfectly still, their masked faces turned toward me as if waiting for a cue. They filled the room, shoulder to shoulder, faces identical to mine, each with hollow, lifeless eyes. "Come in, guest of honor," a voice called from the center of the room. It was my voice, yet it wasn't. It had that same echo, that layered quality, like it came from everywhere at once. The sea of figures parted down the middle, making a narrow path to what I could only describe as a throne, a grotesque, makeshift seat made from twisted branches and tangled strings of Christmas lights that sparked and hissed. Sitting on that throne was the first version of me I'd seen tonight, the one who had driven the car. Their mask was different, cracked and weathered, their eyes oozing a dark, viscous liquid that dripped in slow, deliberate paths down its cheeks. It grinned at me, teeth sharp and glistening, as if it knew every thought racing through my mind. I hesitated, feet glued to the floor, but the figures behind me shifted, pushing me forward with a pressure I couldn't resist. My knees buckled, and I stumbled down the path, their laughter ringing in my ears. The lights blinked above, creating an illusion of movement that made everything sway and twist. My stomach churned, and the mask on my face felt tighter, almost pulsing with each heartbeat. "Do you understand now?" the figure on the throne asked, tilting its head as if studying me. Its voice wrapped around me, squeezing tighter with each syllable. The others echoed its question in a chant. "Do you understand?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My tongue felt heavy, dry, like I hadn't used it in days. Instead, I just shook my head, my vision blurring as panic seeped into my veins. The figure's grin widened, and it gestured with one long, thin hand to the room around us. "You accepted the jingle, and now you're part of us," it said, leaning forward until we were almost nose to nose. The mask on my face burned, the rubber clinging to my skin as if it were melting into it. "You'll wear this face forever, like we do, and you'll spread the word, bring others to join the party, just like we did before you." I backed away, my legs trembling so badly I thought I'd collapse. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, any break in the wall of grinning, masked faces. But everywhere I looked, there was only me, hundreds of me, staring with lifeless eyes, waiting. The mask grew tighter, the edges biting into my skin. I clawed at it, desperate to peel it off, but it was fused now. Part of me. The room erupted in a cheer, hands clapping in a slow, synchronized rhythm that pounded like a drumbeat in my chest. The masked figures began to sway, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes with tangled strings. I screamed, or tried to. The sound came out muffled, trapped behind the suffocating mask. The figure on the throne stood, towering over me. Its eyes met mine, and I saw myself reflected there, countless times over, stretching into infinity. Each version of me wore the same expression, terror mixed with realization, the understanding that this was a cycle I couldn't break. "Your turn," it whispered, placing a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the room spinning as the lights blinked faster, faster, until I felt like I was falling, tumbling through darkness. The next thing I knew, I was outside again, sprawled in the snow, gasping for air. The house was gone, replaced by the quiet, dark street I had grown up on, but everything felt different. The cold didn't bite. It caressed. Familiar. I sat up, my fingers brushing against my face, and froze. The mask was gone, but so was my reflection in the frost-covered car window next to me. Instead, a faint, shadowy figure stared back. It wore the mask I'd seen so many times tonight. My mask, hollow and lifeless. And when I blinked, it smiled. Behind me, the wind whispered, in a voice I knew all too well, "See you next year." I bought a Christmas elf from the dark web. It's watching me when I sleep. Alright, so let me start by saying this. I'm not a reckless person. I don't spend my nights hunting down shady corners of the internet for thrills or shock value. But last December, boredom hit me hard. Work was slowing down. My friends were all out of town for the holidays, and I was left with the kind of restlessness that makes you do stupid things just to feel something. It started like any normal evening. Netflix running in the background, my phone lighting up with holiday spam emails I didn't bother opening. But after an hour of scrolling, I stumbled on a forum that had a thread called Dark Web Curiosities. Have you ever bought anything you regretted? Most of the posts were what you'd expect. Fake haunted dolls, questionable love potions, and those horror stories you're 90% sure are made up. But one post stood out. The title read, "The Elf That Watches." Intrigued, I clicked. The user, whose handle was something like DeepCreeps82, went into detail about an experience buying a tiny, lifelike elf from a vendor on the dark web. It wasn't one of those cheery, felt-covered things you set on a shelf for your kids. No, this was described as disturbingly realistic, with eyes that seemed to follow you around a room and limbs that were eerily jointed. The whole thread was filled with other users chiming in, calling it a hoax or just a gimmick. But a few replies talked about how they'd ordered it too, only to have it show up broken, or worse, staring at them through their own windows at night. You'd think that would be enough for me to close the tab and go back to pretending I was interested in that holiday movie on Netflix. But no, like I said, boredom does weird things to you. Within 20 minutes, I was navigating parts of the internet that would make my antivirus weep. It took a few false starts and browser freezes, but eventually I found it. A simple, black backgrounded site with a single line of text. He sees when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. Below, it was a grainy black and white photo of a tiny, grotesquely detailed elf. It was hunched, as if poised to leap off the page. Its eyes, those were what got me. They weren't your typical doll eyes with glassy, dead stares. No, these looked alive, almost too alive. The buy button pulsed in a sickly green at the bottom of the screen. The price was odd, something like $13.13, as if it were part of some inside joke. I hesitated, hovered over the button, then clicked. A checkout screen popped up, and to my surprise, it didn't even ask for much. Just a name, an address, and the payment details. No confirmation email, no receipt. Just a thank you message. Your elf is on its way. It felt stupid, silly even. I laughed it off and shut down my laptop, figuring I'd just bought some cheap Halloween prop someone was trying to pass off as dark web treasure. 3 days passed, and I mostly forgot about it. The holidays were creeping closer, and the streets outside were filled with twinkling lights and families dragging trees to their cars. That's when I got the package. It was late in the evening, and the mailman had already done his rounds hours ago. Yet, there it was on my doorstep, a small plain brown box with no return address. The only thing written on it was my name in thin, spidery handwriting that made my skin crawl. I brought it inside, laughing nervously at how cold the cardboard felt against my hands. I tore the tape open with the corner of a butter knife, and there it was, nestled in a tangle of old newspaper and yellow tissue paper. The elf. It was even worse in person. Its face was painted in fine, almost grotesque detail. Tiny teeth peeked from a mischievous grin, and its eyes, God, those eyes. They glistened under the soft glow of my kitchen light, pupils so dark they looked like bottomless pits. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. I felt unsettled, like I was suddenly aware of how silent my apartment was. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, it was just a doll, probably made by some artisan with a twisted sense of humor. I set it on the counter, and that was the first night I realized it was going to be a mistake I wouldn't easily forget. When I went to bed, I made sure to shut the kitchen door behind me. Not because I was scared, but because, well, I didn't want it staring at me through the dark. I woke up at 3:13 a.m. to a strange noise. It was faint, like the shuffle of fabric dragging across the floor. I sat up, my heart thudding against my ribs. The room was pitch black, except for the thin stripe of light from the street lamp filtering through the blinds. I reached for my phone, half expecting to see nothing, to hear nothing, when I strained to listen. Then, from the direction of the kitchen, I heard it. A whisper, dry and cracking like old paper. "He sees when you're sleeping." My blood ran cold. I sat frozen, my phone still clutched in my hand like it was a lifeline. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the way shadows could shift and creak in an old apartment. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. My mouth went dry, and a chill prickled up my spine, like icy fingers. With a shaky breath, I pushed myself out of bed. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped towards the kitchen, each creak sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The whisper played on a loop in my mind, echoing and twisting into something worse each time. "He sees when you're sleeping." I reached for the light switch, heart thundering so loud I wondered if my neighbors could hear it. The kitchen lit up in a sudden burst, and I blinked against the harsh fluorescent glow. The elf was exactly where I left it, sitting on the counter, half leaning against the blender. But its position was different. The tiny head, which had been tilted slightly to the side before, was now cocked forward, as if it were watching me. Those eyes, black, glistening, and unblinking, met mine. I forced a laugh, but it sounded brittle, hollow. "Okay, enough of this," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. I walked over and grabbed the elf, its limbs cold and stiff, yet almost lifelike in the way they bent under my fingers. The skin, made from some synthetic material, had a rubbery give to it. I shoved it into a drawer, pushed it shut, and practically ran back to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for that noise again, for that whisper that would confirm I wasn't losing it. But the hours dragged, the shadows in my room stretching and twisting as the minutes passed. The next thing I knew, my alarm was blaring, and the weak winter sunlight seeped through the cracks in the blinds. Morning brought a sort of fragile sanity. The whispers, the dragging noise. Sure, it had been unsettling, but things seemed less terrifying with the sun shining. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks and a series of coincidences. Maybe I'd placed the elf at a different angle than I remembered, or maybe the vent had made some weird noise. It wasn't impossible, but that rationalization crumbled as soon as I stepped into the kitchen. The drawer where I'd stuffed the elf was open, just a crack, but wide enough to see a tiny sliver of red peeking out. I stared at it, trying to process. Did I not close it all the way? I reached for it, hesitating before pulling it open. The elf was there, perched awkwardly, with its tiny arms crossed over its chest, head lolling to the side as if it were mocking me. I slammed the drawer shut and backed up, bumping into the fridge with a dull thud. My hands trembled as I took my phone and snapped a photo of the drawer. I needed proof, something to convince myself I wasn't going crazy. Then I did what any self-respecting adult would do. I Googled it. I spent hours scrolling through forums, articles, and even conspiracy sites. None of them mentioned anything that matched the elf exactly, but a few posts caught my eye. Stories of cursed objects or lifelike dolls that seemed to move on their own. They were usually passed off as hoaxes or elaborate pranks, but the part that stuck with me were the warnings. If an object's presence makes you feel watched, trust your gut. I didn't want to believe that I'd spent money on something that might be cursed or haunted or whatever you'd call it. But that night, the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. I took no chances. I put the elf in a shoebox, duct taped it shut, and tossed it in the closet. Out of sight, out of mind. Or so I hoped. The night felt heavier than usual. Every noise seemed amplified. The creak of a tree branch against the window, the hum of the fridge cycling on, even the ticking of the clock in the living room. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and kept telling myself it was just nerves. Just nerves. But then, around 2:45 a.m., the whispers started again. He sees when you're sleeping. This time, it was louder, clearer. I bolted upright and felt a cold sweat bead on the back of my neck. My eyes darted to the closet door, which was still shut tight. The sound seemed to wrap around the room, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, a soft, scratching noise started. My breath hitched as I realized it was coming from inside the closet. Slow, deliberate, like tiny nails scraping against the wood. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out rational thought. Without thinking, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept propped against my nightstand and moved slowly toward the closet, each step dragging like it took hours. The scratching stopped. I stood there, bat in hand, and reached for the doorknob. It felt ice cold under my palm. With a quick yank, I flung the door open. The shoebox was on its side, the tape barely holding it together. It looked as if it had been chewed or clawed at, tiny gouges carved into the cardboard. But the worst part, the box was empty. The elf was gone. I stared into the empty shoebox, my mind racing so fast it felt like static. The elf was gone. Not misplaced, not shifted to the side. Gone. The gouges in the cardboard seemed to glare up at me, a mocking reminder that something very wrong was happening in my apartment. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight. This wasn't a prank or a trick of the mind. It was real, tangible, and it was happening right now. A sudden creak made me spin around, bat raised. My room was dimly lit, shadows pooling in every corner, stretching with the soft glow of the street lamp outside. My eyes darted to the bed, under the dresser, the tiny gap where the wall met the floor. But there was nothing, just the cold, suffocating silence and the hum of the city outside, oblivious to the terror unraveling in my home. I forced myself to take a deep breath, the bat trembling in my hands. I knew I needed to search the rest of the apartment, the kitchen, the bathroom, the hallway closet, every place the elf could hide. But a part of me didn't want to move, as if staying rooted to that spot would somehow keep the situation from getting worse. Finally, I took a step out of my room. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than usual, the faint smell of dust and old wood hanging heavy in the air. I flipped on every light as I went, flooding the space with the harsh, artificial brightness. The living room was empty, just the flickering shadows of the Christmas lights strung across the windows. Their glow used to feel warm and comforting, but now it seemed sinister, casting jagged patterns across the floor. I edged into the kitchen, bat at the ready. The drawer where the elf had first sat was still slightly open, but there was no sign of it. My stomach churned as I pulled open cabinets, each one creaking as if reluctant to reveal their empty insides. Then I noticed the sliding door that led to the small balcony was unlocked. It shouldn't have been. The tiny, almost imperceptible gap between the glass and the frame made my heart pound harder. The December chill seeped in, biting at my skin as I slid the door open, the track grating like nails on a chalkboard. I stepped out into the icy night, the wind nipping at my cheeks and ruffling my hair. My eyes scanned the concrete, the potted plant by the railing, and the neighboring balconies that jutted out from the building like ledges. I was about to turn back inside when a sound behind me made my blood freeze. A tiny scuttling noise, like something small and fast, darting across the floor. I spun around just in time to see the kitchen light catch the edge of something red, slipping out of sight behind the couch. "Enough of this," I muttered, my voice shaking. I stalked back inside, bat held high, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The air felt suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity as I approached the couch. I peered over the back, expecting to find it sitting there with that grin, those eyes, but there was nothing. A thud sounded behind me, near the hallway. I whipped around and my heart jumped into my throat. The shoebox was there, right in the middle of the hall. I could have sworn it was still in my room. Its lid was off, resting crookedly on the floor, and that was when I saw it. The elf stood next to the box, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes locked on me. This close, I could see the way its painted lips curled just a bit more, the tiny specks of paint chipped away from the corners of its mouth. Its hands were outstretched, fingers thin and bent like claws. The detail was uncanny. The way the shadow beneath its eyes made it look alive, even hungry. The room felt like it was shrinking around me. I lifted the bat and took a shaky step forward, hoping that sheer disbelief would keep it from moving. But the moment I blinked, it wasn't there. I gasped, my vision darting left and right, up to the ceiling, and back down. It was gone, vanished, as if it had melted into the walls. The quiet was shattered by a sharp, metallic sound, a laugh, but it wasn't cheerful. It was brittle and low, like a wind-up toy with dying batteries. My eyes searched frantically, landing on the hallway mirror, and there it was, reflected in the glass, standing in the doorway behind me, face twisted in a grin that stretched too wide, teeth that shouldn't be there peeking through. I spun around, but the doorway was empty. No elf, no movement, just the weight of my ragged breathing and the feeling that the room was wrong, all wrong. I looked back at the mirror, and it was there again, in the corner of the reflection, one hand raised as if waving. I didn't have time to react before the kitchen lights flickered, dimmed, and died. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving me in a silence so deep I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears, and then, so softly it was almost drowned out by my heartbeat, the whisper came again. "He knows when you're awake." I wasn't sure if I'd screamed out loud or just in my head, but when the lights blinked back on, the elf was gone, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wished I hadn't bought that stupid thing, because whatever it was, wherever it came from, it wasn't done with me yet. Daylight was supposed to bring safety, that reassuring glow that melted away night terrors and absurd fears. But when the first hints of dawn seeped through my blinds, painting the room with thin stripes of light. It felt like a false comfort. Sleep had been impossible. My eyes glued to the hallway where the elf had stood, reflected in the mirror, its twisted little grin carved into my brain like an unholy brand. I spent the early morning pacing the apartment, replaying every detail in my head, trying to convince myself it was all some elaborate waking nightmare. But then I'd see the torn shoebox, the way the tape was peeled and shredded as if clawed apart, and doubt would creep back in. By noon, I was exhausted, nerves frayed to the point of snapping. I decided to take action, to get rid of it, whatever it was. I grabbed my phone and searched for any local places that dealt in supernatural or occult items, somewhere that might know what to do. The search results were grim. A few psychic shops, some crystal sellers, but nothing that screamed, "We deal with cursed dark web purchases." So, I made the only call that felt halfway sane. I rang up an old college friend, Ben, who'd always been a bit too into ghost hunting and urban legends. Ben picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy. I didn't even give him time for small talk. "Ben, I need help. Something's in my apartment, and I don't know what to do." There was a pause, then a yawn. "Okay, slow down, man. What kind of something are we talking about?" I recounted everything, finding the elf, the whispers, the scratches, the unsettling reflection in the mirror. As I talked, I kept my eyes darting around the room, half expecting to catch a flash of red peeking from the corner. Ben's voice changed when I finished. The lazy, half-amused tone was gone, replaced with something colder, more serious. "You said it came from the dark web, and it moves on its own. That's not just some cheap prop, man. You need to get out of there." I glanced at the front door, the thought of leaving tugging at me like a lifeline. But the idea of stepping out, only to come home and find it waiting, it made my skin crawl. What if I get rid of it, toss it in the trash, take it somewhere far away? Ben sighed, the kind of sound that didn't promise much hope. "It's worth a shot, but if it's attached to you, distance might not mean anything. Look, I'm gonna drive over, all right? I'll bring some stuff with me. Just keep an eye on it." Easier said than done. I waited, nerves fraying with every passing minute. The apartment felt suffocating, each tick of the wall clock a countdown to some unseen event. The day dragged by in a blur of pacing and peering around corners. I avoided looking in mirrors, avoided the quiet corners of the rooms where I might catch a glimpse of those eyes watching me. It was close to dusk when Ben finally arrived, carrying a duffel bag that rattled with what I assumed were crystals, sage bundles, and whatever other weird tools he kept. He stepped in, eyes scanning the room, as if expecting a ghost to jump out at any second. "You weren't kidding," he muttered, eyes narrowing at the open shoebox in the hall. He dropped the bag on the coffee table and rummaged through it, pulling out a bundle of sage and a lighter. "Where's the elf now?" I shook my head. "I don't know. It was there last night. Then it disappeared when the lights came back on." Ben didn't waste time. He lit the sage, the sharp, earthy scent filling the room as a thin ribbon of smoke curled upward. He walked through the apartment, muttering something under his breath, a chant or a prayer. I couldn't tell. Every corner, every crevice was smoked out, but nothing happened. No sudden noise, no shifting shadows. I started to relax, just a little, when Ben returned to the living room, eyes thoughtful. "If it's not showing itself, it's either hiding or playing with us," he said, glancing at me. "You're sure you haven't heard anything today? No whispers, no noises?" Before I could answer, a soft giggle came from behind us. A small, high-pitched sound that sent ice through my veins. Ben froze, his eyes wide and locked on the reflection in the TV screen. The elf stood there, behind us, perched on the arm of the couch, like it had been listening the whole time. Its head was tilted at that familiar mocking angle, but its eyes, this time, they weren't just painted glass. They blinked. The sage slipped from Ben's hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud as the embered tip scattered ash across the rug. He backed up, whispering, "It's manifesting. We need to." Before he could finish, the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. Panic surged, sharp and immediate. My pulse hammered, my eyes straining to catch any glimmer of movement in the dark. Ben fumbled for something in his bag, muttering curses under his breath. The giggle came again, closer this time, as if the elf were right beside us. Then, a voice, low and playful, sliced through the darkness. "He knows when you're awake." I reached blindly for Ben, but instead my hand brushed against something cold and small. Tiny fingers gripped mine for a heartbeat before I jerked back, the air leaving my lungs in a shudder. The lights sputtered back on, revealing an empty room. The elf was gone, but the space where it had been perched was covered in deep, claw-like scratches, gouged into the fabric of the couch. Ben and I locked eyes, the realization sinking in like lead. This wasn't just a haunted object. It was something worse, something that knew we were scared, and it liked it. The silence that settled after the lights returned was suffocating, a heavy blanket of dread that wrapped around me and Ben like a vice. The gouged fabric on the couch seemed to pulsate under the fluorescent glow, each scratch carved deep and precise. I stared at the marks, my mind looping on one thought. It knows. Ben's face was pale, a fine sheen of sweat dotting his brow as he knelt and grabbed the sage from the floor. His fingers trembled as he lit it again, the smoke curling up in frantic swirls as he chanted something faster, louder. I didn't know what language it was, but the words cracked in the air like static, charged and desperate. Then the giggling started again, soft and muffled. This time, it was coming from the hallway. My eyes darted toward the sound, and I saw it, a tiny shadow skittering along the floor, ducking into the room with the mirror. The door creaked open on its own, just an inch, like an invitation. Ben's chant faltered, and he turned to me with wide, desperate eyes. "We need to confront it," he said, his voice thin. "If we run, it'll keep coming back. It feeds on fear." I swallowed, my mouth dry as bone. The thought of facing that thing, looking into those blinking too real eyes again, made my stomach twist. But he was right. If I wanted any hope of ending this, I couldn't cower anymore. I nodded, gripping the bat in my sweaty palm and taking a step toward the hallway. The apartment seemed to close in around us as we approached the room. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth, like an open grave. The door to the mirror room creaked wider as we neared, revealing the dim, shadow-soaked space. The mirror stood against the wall, reflecting the soft glow of the hallway light and the shapes of our uneasy figures. And then, between us, a third shape appeared. The elf stood in the reflection, its grin wider, eyes glistening with something dark and wet that wasn't paint. I fought the urge to look away, to shut my eyes and pretend it wasn't there. But it blinked, the lids moving in a slow, deliberate sweep, and raised one tiny hand to wave. Ben moved first, stepping into the room and scattering the sage smoke around. "Show yourself," he barked, his voice wavering, but strong. The mirror's surface rippled, like the water's edge disturbed by a breeze. The giggle turned into a hiss, and suddenly the room felt like it was folding in on itself. The walls bent and swayed, the lights flickering as shadows raced across the floor. The elf's reflection leapt out of the glass, landing on the floor with a thud that felt too real, too heavy for something so small. It crouched there, its eyes locked onto mine, dark pools that seemed to suck in the light. And then it spoke, its voice layered with static and malice. "He sees when you're sleeping." The lights died, plunging us into darkness. My breath came out in ragged gasps, ears straining for any hint of movement. I swung the bat blindly, connecting with air and the hard thud of the wall. Ben's chanting started up again, urgent and rapid fire, and for a moment I could almost believe we had a chance. Then I felt it, a tug on my pant leg. Small, cold fingers gripped tight, nails sharp enough to prick through the fabric. I yelped, stumbling backward and kicking out. My foot met resistance, a small crunch that sent the elf skittering into the darkness with a guttural growl. The lights flickered on and off in bursts, casting the room in strobe flashes of nightmarish scenes. The elf was everywhere at once, its tiny form darting from corner to corner, a blur of red and shadow. In one instant, it was at my feet, teeth bared, and in the next, it was scaling the back of a chair, eyes narrowed into hateful slits. Ben shouted something, thrusting the sage out like a weapon. The elf paused, its head tilting in an unnatural way, eyes fixed on the smoking bundle. It hissed, a sound so sharp it felt like needles in my ears, and lunged at him. I acted without thinking, swinging the bat with all my strength. The force of it connected mid-air, knocking the elf into the mirror. The glass shattered, shards spraying like rain and catching in the dim light as they clattered to the floor. The elf shrieked, a sound so piercing it rattled my teeth, and then silence. The mirror lay shattered in dozens of pieces, each shard reflecting fractured glimpses of the room. The elf was gone, no trace left but the shredded couch and the gouges on the hardwood floor. The quiet that followed was thick, broken only by the faint crackle of the burning sage and the rapid, shallow breaths Ben and I were gasping. He dropped to the floor, one hand over his face. Is it gone?" he whispered. I didn't answer, couldn't find my voice as I looked around, half expecting the elf to leap out from the shadows. But the room felt different, lighter somehow. The oppressive chill was lifting, replaced by a stagnant calm. It took a long time before we dared to move, to pick up the shattered glass and sweep away the ash. By the time the room was clean, morning light was already bleeding through the cracks in the blinds, painting the walls with a soft, tired glow. The elf was gone, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just the broken glass that had banished it. It was the realization, the refusal to let fear be its weapon. But even now, as the morning light spills across the room, and Ben mutters about needing a drink strong enough to forget, I can't shake the feeling that those eyes, those cold, blinking eyes, are still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. And I'm afraid that one day, when I least expect it, the whispers will come back. He knows when you're awake. I found a dark web stream that shows the true story behind famous haunted houses. My own house was on the list. All right, so I've never been one to get into the whole dark web thing. Yeah, I'd heard the stories, most of them probably exaggerated or straight up lies, I thought. You know, the typical tales about hitmen, black markets, creepy videos that make your skin crawl. I dismissed it all as urban legends or clickbait content. But that changed a few months ago, and I'm telling you, I wish I'd stayed ignorant. It all started on one of those slow nights when you're bored out of your mind and click through random sites like a zombie. A buddy of mine, Chris, had sent me a cryptic text earlier. If you're bored, check this out, but be careful. Attached was a link, one that looked like a jumble of nonsense. No .com, no .net, just numbers, letters, and a little dread swimming in my gut. I probably should have ignored it, but curiosity's a hell of a drug. I mean, what could one harmless click really do? Famous last words, right? So, I opened my Tor browser, pasted in the link, and hit enter. The page loaded with a sluggishness that only dial-up users would remember, but eventually, the screen flickered to life. It was simple, like a relic of the early internet. Black background, white text, no images. A red banner blinked at the top with the words, "Welcome to the Museum of True Hauntings. Enter if you dare." I chuckled to myself, half expecting a bad jump scare or some grainy footage that wasn't worth the time. I hit enter anyway. Suddenly, the screen morphed into a grainy video feed. The quality was garbage, like someone was streaming with a camera they found in their basement back in 2005. The first video popped up, labeled, "The Truth About Amityville." The footage was dark, shaky, and accompanied by the kind of background noise that made my skin itch. It didn't look like any documentary I'd seen. It was like watching raw, unedited footage of something that should never see the light of day. But here's where it gets weird. Unlike the polished stories you hear on YouTube or see in documentaries, this video had real footage. Not just reenactments, but shadowy figures, guttural whispers, and the kind of screams that make your blood curdle. People spoke in clipped voices, panicked and pleading. In one scene, you could barely make out a room that was practically vibrating with energy. And there, in the corner, something moved. Something that wasn't human. It was subtle, but enough to send my heart into overdrive. I couldn't stop watching. It was like my brain was locked onto it, feeding on the fear, the rawness. The feed cut off abruptly with a message. Next case begins in 5 minutes. Underneath, there was a list of upcoming episodes. I scanned through them quickly, recognizing familiar names. The Winchester Mystery House, the Enfield Poltergeist, even the Villisca Axe Murder House. But as my eyes roamed the list, I saw it. Near the bottom, right before the Sally House, there was an entry that froze my breath in my chest. The Henderson Residence, home of the Smiling Man. My heart dropped, because that was my house. I should probably explain. The Henderson Residence, as it was labeled, was my parents' old home, a 2-story Victorian monstrosity that stood in the middle of our small town. I moved back in after they passed, mostly out of obligation and a little nostalgia, but nothing ever seemed right about the place. Not the creaky floorboards that groaned even when no one walked on them. Not the way doors would drift open without a hint of a breeze, and definitely not the shadow I'd sometimes see just beyond the edge of my vision. But I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Until now. The stream clicked back on, showing a countdown, 3 minutes left until the Henderson Residence. Every instinct screamed at me to shut down the computer, walk away, and forget I ever saw this. But I couldn't. The need to know what the dark web had to say about my own home was stronger than the fear that sat like a stone in my chest. I waited, every second crawling by slower than the last. When the countdown hit 0, the screen shifted and a new video began. This wasn't just any story. This was my story, and it was about to get very real. The screen flickered, and my room felt suddenly colder. The video was labeled The Henderson Residence, Home of the Smiling Man, and beneath it, an eerie message blinked. This footage has been verified for authenticity. The grainy video opened with a shot of my house, and I swear, it felt like my computer monitor was looking back at me. I could see the chipped white paint, the ivy that crept along the sides, and the old oak tree that stood in the front yard, like a silent guardian. But this wasn't filmed from the street. No, it was shot from an angle that suggested whoever was holding the camera was standing on my lawn. My throat tightened as the footage shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. A light was on in the upstairs window, my bedroom window. But this video wasn't from tonight. No, this was older, the timestamp showing it had been recorded 6 months ago, back when I still thought the strange noises and cold drafts were just quirks of the old house. A low voice started narrating, scratchy and void of emotion. The Henderson residence, known locally as the home of the Smiling Man, has a history that the public rarely speaks of. The camera panned slowly through my house, showing angles I recognized all too well. The hallway lined with old family photos, the staircase that creaked if you so much as breathed near it, and the narrow kitchen where every late-night snack came with a feeling of being watched. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the familiarity. It was the subtle, almost imperceptible details that weren't supposed to be there, like the shadow at the end of the hallway that seemed to flicker when the camera passed over it, or the sound of faint laughter in the background, just barely audible, but enough to make my scalp prickle. Legend says, the voice continued, that the Smiling Man is not a ghost, but something far older. He is seen only in glimpses, in reflections, where he shouldn't be. And his presence comes with a price. Sanity, stolen piece by piece. The screen cut to what looked like an old, handwritten journal entry. The paper yellowed and edges cold. The words were scrawled in a frantic hand. It's not just the noise. It's the smile. He smiles when I'm alone, but he grins when he knows I've seen him. My chest tightened, and I leaned back in my chair, glancing around my room as if half expecting to catch a twisted grin in the reflection of my dark window. The stream had me hooked, and yet I wanted nothing more than to shut it off, pretend I hadn't seen any of it. But I couldn't. The video jumped back to the footage of my house, this time taken from inside. The camera was shaky, moving slowly down the hallway, its viewfinder darting toward the rooms on either side. A door creaked open, and I realized it was my parents' old room. The camera lingered just inside the doorway, and the angle suggested the person filming was trying to stay hidden, like they were afraid of being seen. My pulse thudded in my ears when I heard it, the faint sound of humming. It was off-key, discordant, like a lullaby sung by someone who had forgotten the tune. I'd heard that same sound before, late at night, when I'd convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But hearing it here, in a video that wasn't supposed to exist, made my hands shake. Suddenly, the camera jerked to the left, and for a second, I saw him. The Smiling Man. He was reflected in the vanity mirror across the room, Just a silhouette at first, tall and thin, but then he leaned forward, his face coming into the dim light. His eyes were hollow, as if someone had carved them out, and his grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that didn't fit quite right in his mouth, like jagged, uneven tombstones. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just watched. I slammed my laptop shut and sat there in silence, my heartbeat thundering as if it was trying to escape my chest. The room felt oppressive, the quiet too loud, like the air itself was vibrating with something unseen. Then I heard it. A floorboard creaked upstairs. The same familiar groan that always came from the hallway, just outside my room. I didn't dare move. Not at first. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was just the house settling, just wood shifting in the cold. But deep down, I knew better, because that sound was followed by a soft, almost polite knock at my bedroom door, and from the other side, a voice whispered, just barely loud enough to hear, "I knew you'd find me." I sat frozen in my chair, every muscle coiled with the terror I couldn't shake. The knock was soft, patient, as if whoever was behind my door had all the time in the world. I swallowed hard, straining to hear more, but the silence that followed was as dense as a shroud. Seconds passed like hours. The thudding of my heartbeat roared in my ears, and I forced myself to breathe, to move. My eyes darted around my room, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. My old baseball bat leaned against the corner by the closet, its wood chipped and splintered from years of use. I edged toward it, every step making the floor creak louder than I wanted. As I reached for the bat, the knock came again, louder this time. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't imagined it. The sound was real, tangible, like a fist tapping a hollow drum. But there was something else now, something that sent a chill racing down my spine. A soft, rhythmic scratching, as if nails were lightly dragging down the wood of the door. I clutched the bat tightly and stood motionless, staring at the handle, expecting it to turn, to jiggle, to move. But it didn't. It just sat there, indifferent and unmoving, as if mocking me for my fear. Then, without warning, the whisper came again. "I knew you'd find me." This time, it was clearer, sharper, like the words had been spoken just on the other side of the door, mere inches from where I stood. My stomach twisted. I could feel a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. "Who's there?" I forced out, my voice trembling, weaker than I wanted it to be. No response, just silence. And then it hit me. The video. The smiling man. The strange feed that had felt more like a curse message than a documentary. My mind raced with thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. I hadn't even finished watching, hadn't stayed long enough to learn what came next. And now, whatever had been confined to that screen, whatever nightmare had been narrated in that motionless voice, had bled out into my world. I took a step back, my foot pressing against the floorboard that always squeaked. The sound seemed deafening, and suddenly the scratching on the door stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the knob turned, slowly, almost lazily, as if whatever was behind the door was savoring the moment. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. The door didn't open, but the turning knob felt like a promise, an unspoken threat. I lifted the bat, hands shaking, eyes wide, and just like that, the sound stopped. The knob released with a faint click, and the room went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that hums in your ears, filling the space with the heavy weight of something unseen. I stood there, muscles coiled, for what felt like hours. I listened for movement, for breathing, for anything, but there was nothing. The air felt thick, pressing in on me from all sides. Finally, I lowered the bat, exhaling shakily. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the video had just gotten under my skin more than I thought, and the creaks and whispers were all in my head. Maybe a giggle, a low, throaty giggle coming from behind me. I spun around, heart jumping to my throat, but there was nothing. My room was just as I'd left it, cluttered and dimly lit by the glow of my desk lamp. The shadows in the corners didn't move, didn't shift. But that laugh, there was no mistaking it. It had been real. I backed up against the door, my hand blindly groping for the lock, fumbling until I felt it click into place. I didn't know if a simple lock would help, but it was something. The laugh echoed in my mind, looping like a broken record, the image of the smiling man's face etched behind my eyes. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a notification that made my blood turn to ice. Stream resumed. The Henderson residence, home of the smiling man. Watch now. The video feed was back, taunting me, luring me to continue down a path I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. But this time, it felt different, like watching wasn't just an option, it was a necessity, a compulsion, as if the story wouldn't stop at my door, as if the smiling man wouldn't rest until I'd heard the whole grim tale. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone, the glow illuminating my face, the reflection in the darkened screen catching something that made my heart stutter. My own pale face, and just over my shoulder, a shadow with a grin that stretched too wide. I stared at the darkened reflection on my phone screen, my own wide eyes locked onto the shadow behind me. But when I spun around, the room was empty. My breath came in shallow, rapid gasps as I scanned every corner, my grip on the bat so tight that my knuckles ached. The silence felt like a living thing, wrapping around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. But then the phone buzzed again, drawing my eyes back to the screen. The notification still glowed, pulsing almost, as if urging me to tap it. The urge to watch, to understand, was overwhelming. Maybe if I knew what came next, I could piece together how to end this, how to make it stop. With a deep, shaky breath, I clicked on the link. The video loaded with a jittery lag, pixels coalescing into the same grainy feed. The camera panned down the hallway of my house, the one I was standing in at that very moment. This time, there was no narration, only the hiss of static and the occasional crackle that sounded too much like footsteps on old wood. The camera moved toward my bedroom door, and my breath caught when I realized this wasn't just footage, it was live. I could feel the room around me shift, the air growing colder, as the video showed the camera approaching the very door I leaned against. My blood turned to ice when I heard a sound not from the phone, but from behind me. A soft, deliberate knock, just like before. My instincts screamed at me to run, to bolt out the window, to do anything but stand there glued to the screen. But my body refused to listen. The knock came again, firmer this time. In the feed, the camera zoomed in on the door handle, and I could see it begin to twist, just as it had before. "I knew you'd find me," the whisper came again, this time clearer, as if spoken directly into my ear. I flinched and dropped the phone, the screen clattering against the hardwood floor. But even without it in my hand, I could hear the video playing, the sound tinny and warped from the small speaker. The camera pushed the door open slowly, and in the shadows beyond, something shifted. I fell to my knees, scrambling to pick up the phone, to turn it off. to end this waking nightmare, but as soon as my fingers brushed the screen, the video froze on an image that I wish I could burn from my mind. The smiling man stood in the center of my room, tall and skeletal, with limbs that bent at wrong angles, his mouth twisted into a grin so wide it looked painful, showing every jagged tooth. But it was his eyes that made my pulse stutter. They were empty, dark pits, as if someone had bored into his skull and left nothing behind. And then he moved, not in the video, but behind me. I spun around, bat raised, but I was too slow. The room seemed to swell with darkness, a suffocating void that pressed down on me like a weight. A shape loomed in the gloom, impossibly close, and before I could react, cold fingers brushed my arm. I gasped and swung the bat blindly, the wood meeting empty air. The darkness thinned for just a moment, enough for the pale face to flicker into view, inches from mine. His grin stretched wider, a whispering sigh of laughter that slithered over my skin and left me frozen in place. My pulse pounded in my ears, blocking out everything except the echo of that laugh. The lights flickered, and the darkness receded as quickly as it had come. I staggered backward, heart hammering, chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. The room was empty, still, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. The smiling man was here, whether I could see him or not. And he was waiting. My phone buzzed once more, the notification flashing with a single line of text that made my knees weak. End the story, or he will. The screen went dark, and the silence returned, heavy and absolute. I glanced around my room, the shadows stretching and shifting with every breath. I had to finish watching, I realized, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know how this story ended. Because if I didn't, the smiling man would. The house felt alive now, pulsing with an energy that I couldn't see, but could feel deep in my bones. My grip on the baseball bat was slick with sweat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard I tried to steady my breathing, the smiling man was listening, savoring the tremor in my chest. The video on my phone had gone dark, leaving only my warped reflection in the blank screen, eyes wide and wild. I knew what it meant. Finish the story or face whatever punishment the smiling man had in mind. I wasn't sure which was worse, but the choice had already been made for me. I tapped the screen, opening the dark web stream once more. This time, there was no countdown, no pause. The feed jumped straight into motion, showing the same live view of my house. My breath caught in my throat as the camera moved into my room. The perspective shifted, scanning the familiar clutter of my desk, my unmade bed, and finally, the window with its dark glass. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then the camera angle jerked suddenly, as if the person holding it had been grabbed or startled. The phone's microphone picked up a noise that made my skin prickle, a slow, wet, dragging sound like fabric being pulled across the floor. I glanced down, half expecting to see the shadow of something slithering across my feet, but the room was still. The video, though, had changed. The camera had turned toward the closet, its door now ajar. Darkness yawned inside, deep and impenetrable, as if it stretched far beyond the limits of my small room. The dragging sound came again, and this time it was louder, closer. In the video, a pale hand emerged from the closet's shadows, fingers impossibly long and thin, tips curling in a beckoning gesture. My throat tightened, and my eyes darted to my own closet door, closed, but rattling ever so slightly, as if something inside was pushing against it. I tightened my grip on the bat, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I stayed rooted, waiting for what I knew was coming. A whisper, close enough to tickle the hairs on the back of my neck, said, "Watch closely." The video feed stuttered, and the camera zoomed in on the face of the smiling man, who now stood half in shadow, half illuminated by the soft glow from my bedside lamp. His eyes were still voids, but they seemed to shift, drinking in the light and reflecting nothing. His grin curled into a grotesque parody of human expression, stretching wider, his skin cracking at the corners of his mouth. In the footage, he raised a finger to his lips as if to shush me, then tilted his head slightly to the side, listening. I realized, with a sick jolt, that he was mimicking me, mirroring the way I stood, bat in hand, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The figure took one step forward, the motion slow and deliberate, and a sound that was part laughter, part moan, crawled out of the speakers. The closet in my room rattled harder, a shiver running through the wood. My mouth was dry, each swallow like sandpaper, but I forced myself to move. I stepped backward, eyes locked on the door as the video kept playing. The smiling man was moving closer in the feed, one step at a time, his fingers brushing the walls, his smile never faltering. I glanced at the screen, then at my closet. The rattling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, a moment that stretched far beyond reason. Then, without warning, the closet door in the video burst open, and the camera dropped to the floor, shattering into static. The final image was seared into my mind. The smiling man's face, inches from the lens, mouth gaping as if in a silent scream. A cold gust of air swept past me, and the closet door in my room swung open, hinges groaning. My heart stopped, eyes wide as darkness pooled out like ink. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as a shadow, tall and thin, uncoiled from the gloom. It stepped into the room, its mouth splitting into that familiar, impossible grin. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was his voice, sharp and mocking. "Now, it's your turn to smile."